Okay.
All right. Okay. So let me introduce you again. So hello, everyone. So we have Arvind here today. Arvind is a research scientist at Facebook AI Research and a visiting postdoc at UC Berkeley, hosted by Peter Abil. Arvind received his MS and PhD in computer science from the University of Washington and his BTech degree from IIT Madras. His research focuses on the algorithmic foundations of deep learning and reinforcement learning. Applications of these algorithms include robotics, personalized recommendation systems, and graphics. Arvind received JP Morgan PhD Fellowship Award in 2020, a best paper in IEEE SIMPA 2018, and a best undergraduate thesis from IIT Madras in 2015. And his talk is about model-based algorithms for offline learning. So with this, Arvind, all yours.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks in particular to the organizers for inviting me. It's been a great workshop, and it's also great to see so many friends and familiar faces in the audience. So looking forward to more interactions with everyone. Yeah, for today's talk, I would probably like to start by motivating the talk by looking at some major breakthroughs in AI in the recent years. So we've seen major advances in image recognition, captioning, language understanding, game playing, and so on. And if you look at the broad techniques and approaches that have powered these advances, we can start to see some common patterns emerging. All of these advances combine massive in-domain datasets with ever-improving computational capabilities. I emphasize in-domain data because training and evaluations are typically in very similar conditions. So this is especially evident in the case of RL examples on the right, where we train our policies on one game like Dota or Go and evaluate the agent in the same game. So that said, there are also some major differences between the computer vision and NLP success stories that I've shown here on the left and the RL stories on the right. In the case of vision and NLP, we're using largely real-world data sets, and as a result, we immediately see a lot of impact and utility for real-world applications. By scraping the web, we can collect large data sets with millions of data points that have been uploaded by humans and real-world situations, like real-world images that have been that contain text descriptions about what is actually in those images. The vision and NLP examples are also predominantly passive learning settings, in the sense that we predominantly download a data set from the internet and we learn our neural network models on them. In contrast, the RL examples on the right consist of data sets that are generated by the agents as the agents interact with the environment. Now, it is very clear that generating such massive data sets that amount for like millions of gameplay trials or like tens of thousands of hours of gameplay, they are only really possible in simulated settings. So the basic hypothesis for this talk is that we need to utilize passive data sets or offline data progress in real-world reinforcement learning, because the complexity of the data that we would require cannot be generated interactively by the agents for each and every task. And I'll primarily discuss about different algorithmic approaches for achieving this goal of learning from passive data sets. So Sergey gave an excellent overview talk about offline RL yesterday, and my talk will be quite complementary to his presentation, since Sergey did not cover model-based algorithms, and I'll be primarily focusing on them. And I'll also do just a brief recap just to refresh and bring everyone to the same page. So offline RL is the setting where we need to learn a control policy using only a pre-collected data set of interactions with the environment. So the world is somehow generating some data set by various amounts of exploratory policy, and we have a fixed data set of experience, and the agent is trying to learn a good policy from this fixed data set of experience. This workflow is very representative of what we see in a supervised learning setting and has been extremely successful in vision and NLP. And the major appeal of this paradigm is that we can reuse large amounts of historical available data, and such data sets are readily available if we think about applications like autonomous driving, recommendation systems, and industrial automation. And furthermore, since we kind of separate data collection from policy learning, we also sidestep the autonomous exploration challenge. And as a result, this paradigm is also very appealing to safety critical healthcare, because the policies are in some sense not exploring by themselves, so you don't have to deal with many regulatory issues. The offline data set can come from a combination of different data sources, like any historical data sets, some hand-designed safe policies, or even human expert demonstrations. And in practice, we may have to typically use this data set to learn a policy and then collect some more data for some amount of fine-tuning. And this is very similar to what we also observe in vision and NLP, where we do large amounts of pre-training on some data set and very minimal fine-tuning for the desired application of interest. But the bulk of the work is really going to be in this initial pre-training phase of learning a good policy from this fixed offline data set experience. So overall, the hope is that using large offline data sets can reduce interactive sample complexity, address safety concerns, and expand the overall applicability of RL. And the central research question here in this paradigm is how do we design algorithms for learning policies from static offline datasets? And to motivate the challenges here and why it is actually worthwhile thinking about this from an algorithmic viewpoint, let's say that we consider an example where we have collected datasets for autonomous driving. And typically all these datasets are going to be cars driving on the road. So a model data can erroneously make the generalization that all of the world is comprised of roads, and to get from point A to point B, all you have to do is drive on just like a straight line. And this is sort of consistent with what the agent has observed in the data set, because it has only observed cars driving on proper roads. So how do we overcome this challenge? Well, one possibility is we can adaptively collect more data, and this problem would sort of go away. For example, if we crash a few times and collect data about those crashes, we can perhaps learn how not to crash. However, this sort of additional data collection is not consistent with the offline pattern. And furthermore, like crashing to learn how not to crash seems like a very expensive and not a scalable way of learning autonomous driving. So an alternate approach that we can rely on is to perform regularization to communicate to the learning algorithm to respect the dataset distribution and not stray too far from it. This regularization in some form or the other is very crucial for any offline RL algorithm. And most of the offline RL algorithms that you would see in literature are essentially different ways of incorporating these regularizations in clever forms. And there has been an explosion of recent interest in offline RL with like many papers coming out of very diverse organizations. So here is just a sample set of some of these papers. But what is very curious, almost most of these papers are predominantly model-free in nature. And the project that I'm going to talk about shortly is one of the first projects that introduced a model-based approach to dealing with offline RL. And this project is Moral, and this is sort of done in collaboration with Rahul Kidambi, Praneeth Netrapalli, and Thorsten Joachims. So to motivate this, let's first consider a naive model-based approach as shown in the bottom left. So we will simply learn a neural network dynamics model using the offline dataset and optimize a policy using the learned model. So this can be done with any reinforcement learning algorithm, like Q-learning, policy gradients, Monte Carlo tree search, and so on. Once we have the learned model MHAT, we can use any algorithm to learn a policy in it. But this naive approach shown on the bottom left will actually not work precisely because of the distribution shift issue that we just discussed, and we need to incorporate regularization in some form. So we address this in our moral algorithm by incorporating the key idea of pessimism or conservatism in the face of uncertainty. So this is almost the exact opposite of what you would typically hear about in exploration algorithms in the context of optimism in the face of uncertainty. So what we can do is first train an error-aware pessimistic MDP model, what I'm calling PMDP or MP hat over here. And this has a very special property. The value in this pessimistic MDP will be an approximate lower bound of the true value function. And this makes the pessimistic MDP a very good surrogate for the purposes of policy optimization. So the overall flow diagram is shown on the bottom right. We learn like an approximate dynamics model using the offline data set. And then we construct this pessimistic MDP MP hat. And I'll describe the details of this pessimistic MDP shortly. Once we have constructed this pessimistic MDP, we can simply, again, use any policy optimization algorithm to learn a policy. And then we can simply deploy that policy in the environment. And overall, when we compare these two approaches, the model and the naive model-based approach over here, what we see is that the major difference is just this introduction of this additional pessimistic MDP, in which we will perform all our planning rather than in the naive learned MDP MHAT. Maybe I can stop here and take one or two questions if there are any before I proceed about the details of the pessimistic MDP.
So when you say, yeah, I had a question. So pessimistic NDP will have the same state action formulations?
Yes, so I'll describe the details of the construction very shortly.
Okay. Any other questions, audience? You can proceed, Arvind.
Oh, great. Yeah, so the idea behind the pessimistic MDP is really quite simple and can be explained visually. The idea is to partition the state action space into known and unknown regions. So this pessimistic MDP will have the same state and action spaces. It's just going to be a change in the dynamics function and the reward function. And that change will be driven by partitioning the state space or the state action space into known and unknown regions. So for simplicity, let's assume that this 2D representation is the state action space of the MDP. And the actual raw data points in our data set is represented by these blue dots. So what we would call the known region are those regions or those state and actions for which we can guarantee that the learned model will be accurate. And there are various ways in which we can provide such guarantees, like finite sample bounds and so on. And that really depends on the details of the function approximation class and so on. But for simplicity, let's say that any place where we can guarantee that the learned model will be accurate. And by accurate specifically, it means in some divergence measure, let's say total variation distance, the learned model P hat will be close to the true dynamics model P up to, it's no more different than a degree alpha. And alpha is a choice that we use for this pessimistic MDP. And typically we can derive these guarantees without actually knowing what the true P is by using finite sample analysis. And any place where we cannot provide such a guarantee that the learned, we will be pessimistic or conservative and call that particular state action pair as unknown. So that's how we are going to do this partitioning. And the partitioning is pessimistic in nature in the sense that only those places where we can actually guarantee that the model will be accurate, we are going to treat them as known. Any other state action pair, we are going to assume the worst and treat it as unknown. And a modification, this is the critical part in the pessimistic MDP, is that anytime the agent enters into the unknown region in this pessimistic MDP, we're going to modify the reward function and the transition function to force a transition to a low reward absorbing state. So if the agent wanders into the red region or the unknown region, it magically gets teleported into a low reward absorbing state and stays there sort of perpetually. And the broad intuition here is very simple, is that we are essentially penalizing the agent for going into unknown states. And since policy optimization algorithms will avoid low reward states because we are trying to optimize the rewards, we will end up avoiding visiting the unknown regions. And this implicitly provides the regularizing effect. Inside the known regions, the reward functions are identical to that of the original MDP, which allows us to make progress on the actual task of interest. So this kind of essentially provides us a constrained MDP where we can make progress on the task. Step out of this known region, we're going to heavily penalize it. And as a result, we will implicitly get the regularizing effect. So this is like a very simple intuition. And we can actually formalize these insights into the form of a theorem as well. So suppose we learn a near optimal policy in the pessimistic MDP, then the suboptimality compared to pi star, which is the optimal policy in the unknown MDP. We are comparing the performance of the optimal policy in the unknown MDP, output policy of our algorithm, which is the optimal policy in the pessimistic MDP, evaluated on the true unknown MDP. And this suboptimality is governed by two terms. The first term is related to model errors in the known states. So crucially, the difference between a more naive model-based RL analysis would be that the bounds would depend on the worst case model error on the errors within the known regions. And hopefully, at least in the known regions where we have a lot of data support, the model error is likely to be low. So we are not going to get too burned by this particular term. And then there's going to be a second term, which is sort of based on a new quantity that we introduce in our analysis, which is what we call the unknown region hitting time. So this TU pi star is the first time step the optimal policy will end up entering into the unknown region. Now, if the support of the dataset is sufficiently broad, such that basically we either don't have unknown regions at all, or the states that are visited by the optimal policy actually only cover known states, and we don't have to go to the unknown regions to recover the optimal policy, then the second term will basically drop off to zero because the unknown region hitting time will be infinity. And we are only governed by the standard local modeling error, which is unavoidable pretty much in any model-based RL algorithm. On the other hand, if the support of the dataset is such that we cannot actually capture the optimal policy, then this analysis actually makes it very clear to what degree that we can actually compete with the optimal policy. And basically, we can keep on track with the optimal policy till it enters into the unknown region. But beyond that horizon, we really have no visibility and we can't compete with the optimal policy. And interestingly, this rate that we find actually matches an information theoretic lower bound that is applicable for any offline RL algorithm. So in that sense, Morel is actually minimax optimal. So there exist hard problem instances where no algorithm can be better than Morel. Of course, what we would ideally like is like an instance specific optimality guarantee, but I think those types of guarantees tend to be very hard for hard problem instances like RL. So in general, minimax optimality is typically what we would like to shoot for. And it's actually interesting that a fairly simple construction like this Morel algorithm achieves this minimax optimality. So maybe I can again stop here and take one or two questions if there are any about the pessimistic construction.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. Okay, there are more. Okay, let me read it out one by one. Are we losing out on generalization by being pessimistic?
That's a good question. Actually, we do have a good degree of generalization in the sense that a very naive, like sort of if we think about an importance sampling like algorithm or a pure tabular algorithm, it can basically only learn exactly wherever we have the support. Like it can only learn on the blue dots. Here we do get some degree of generalization, which enriches the blue dots to this green region. But beyond some level, like there is this tussle between regularization and generalization. And we probably don't want to try to overgeneralize because then you can get burned by these instances like autonomous driving where you go off the road because you don't learn to respect the data distributions.
Okay, then which brings to the next question. What about exploration?
Yes, so that's another interesting question. So the whole premise in offline RL is that we are trying to learn from a fixed data set. So whatever is the best policy that is learnable out of that fixed data set is what we are trying to achieve. And any further improvement actually requires true exploration in the environment. And that is sort of out of scope in offline RL. And this is motivated by the fact that if we think about like vision and NLP, you are just predominantly doing passive learning and are actually succeeding in the real world. Like even though we make IID assumptions in supervised learning and so on, when we end up learning these models on very diverse offline distributions, they end up working pretty well in the real world because they tend to capture many modes of the real world fairly well. So if we assume that the same trend also holds in RL, then hopefully the offline distribution is sufficiently wide that we don't have to worry too much about exploration, or we can deal with it in the fine-tuning phases a little bit.
Okay, nice. The next question is, okay, follow up on Jayabrata's question. Okay, once some path with reward is found, what incentivizes the model to look at unknown regions for higher rewards?
So there is sort of there are two levels of exploration over here. One is the exploration where the agent actually interacts with the real environment and essentially collects new real data. Another type of exploration is basically happening in this inner loop where we are trying to learn a policy that is optimal for this pessimistic MDP. And this is purely the agent is just interacting with the learned simulator model. And there you are free to do any sort of exploration that you want. You can try out very different actions. And there you might actually end up going into unknown regions initially in the hope of like high rewards because you're going to new regions. Maybe there's some intrinsic motivation to go there. But once you recognize that, okay, this is an unknown region. If I go there, I'm getting penalized a lot. You will probably avoid going into unknown regions.
Okay. I think you can continue, Arvind, now.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I just want to describe quickly how we can instantiate this sort of conceptual algorithm in practice. So for a practical implementation, we basically just need two components, a way to partition the state space into known and unknown regions, and a way to optimize the policy in this pessimistic MDP. So for partitioning the state space, we use an approach involving ensembles of dynamics models that all essentially try to predict the next state condition on the state and action pair. So we have multiple networks. Each network is initialized independently, and all of on the same data set, but using different mini batch sequences. So the hope is that if all the neural network models agree on their predictions of the next state, it means that there has to actually have been a state action pair in the vicinity of this SA query for the network to all agree on the same prediction, because the data will force the network to agree. But in places where we do not have this support and we are using a new query SA that is very different from any data that we have seen in the data set, then it is very likely that the networks will not agree because they are initialized independently, they're trained on different mini batch sequences, and they are regularized differently. And as a result, there will be a lot of divergence in the next state predictions. And we can use this disagreement between the model predictions as a proxy for designating this known and unknown states. So we'll just pick some threshold as a hyperparameter and say that if the models agree within that particular threshold, that particular query state action pair will be considered known. Otherwise, it would be considered unknown. And for policy optimization, we simply use like iterative policy optimization algorithms like NPG or PPO. These methods are particularly appealing because all they require are samples to be generated from the learned model. And since the learned model is sort of under our control and as real world, we can generate as many samples as we want freely. And in particular, if we have like a neural network dynamics model and GPUs, we can roll out like thousands of trajectories in parallel. And as a result, like in just a few hundred iterations, these policy gradient algorithms tend to converge pretty well. So as a way of experimental evaluation, we consider a few locomotion tasks from a well-known offline RL benchmark called D4RL. This was a benchmark introduced by Sergey Levin and the students, and he also described this in his talk yesterday. So there are different data sets for each of these simulated characters. So the goal is to make these simulated characters walk forward, essentially, walk or hop as appropriate for the morphology of the agent. And we consider different types of offline data sets. So a data set that is essentially contains interactions with a completely random policy. So you can say that this contains a score of 0. Then there is a medium performant policy, which has like approximately 40 to 50 normalized reward. And then there is a medium replay and a medium expert. So all of these contain different qualities in the data set. So what we find is that across the board, our algorithm extremely well. I realize that there are like a lot of numbers here and it's hard to parse it. So we can maybe look at a more pictorial description. So what we find is that on the number of tasks where an algorithm obtains the best results, we find that our algorithm Morel actually attains the best results on the most number of tasks, followed by CQL, MOPO, and a few other algorithms. Most of these other algorithms that I'm showing here are model-free because, as I mentioned, our work was one of the first to propose a model-based algorithm. And also in terms of the average performance, we again find that our method is the best among all of the alternatives that we compare with over here. And another interesting observation is that on the compute requirements for the algorithm, we again find that Morel is the most efficient. And that is simply because learning the dynamics model is like a one-time cost and is relatively simple. That's very similar to supervised learning or self-supervised learning. We know how to do them very well. Just in a couple hundred epochs, we can get like a pretty good dynamics model. And then once we have the dynamics model, then optimizing the policy is very efficient, as I mentioned, because all we require are just thousands of rollouts to occur in parallel and a few hundred policy update steps. And they can be done in a matter of few minutes if equipped with a again, with that, maybe I can stop again for a minute and take one or two questions. And there are a couple of extensions of this project that I will discuss after that.
This is a very generic question. These results, right? They depend a lot on the seeding, right? Initial seeds. So is there a generic template as to how to get these seeds? Do we have to read from those papers to get the seeds, or can't we do like a benchmarking where we can actually compare different algorithms?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. And this used to be a problem or a big problem in DeepRL a while ago, but I think it has relatively subsided. In particular, it has subsided somewhat in offline RL, and that is for the reason that these random seed issues typically plague the algorithms when the algorithms themselves are collecting the data. So if a particular agent is just equipped with a very lucky random seed, it might end up collecting better data, and as a result might perform better, even though the algorithm intrinsically is not better, it just got lucky. But that problem is less in offline RL because all of the algorithms use the exact same data set. So the data set itself does not change across like any of the here. So as a result, the variability in results is relatively less, but there are still some other issues. For example, it is still very hyperparameter sensitive. And for tuning these hyperparameters, you have to like churn through like, many different hyperparameters. So depending on how well someone tuned their hyperparameters, the results could vary quite a bit. So although the random seed issue is not present, the hyperparameter issue is still present, but it's perhaps a better problem to have than the random seeds because at least it's under our control.
Okay. And there are a couple of questions in the chat window. Pramod is asking, does model-based offline struggle with stitching unlike CQL?
That's a good question. It typically, there is no reason to expect that model-based methods would struggle because it depends on what policy optimization algorithm that we end up using. So I think Sergey's argument was that if you use particular styles of algorithms, they don't have this very good stitching properties, like things that resemble behavior cloning more. But there is nothing stopping us from using a Q-learning style algorithm to optimize the policy in the pessimistic MTP. So if we are considering domains where stitching is very important, we can just use that particular choice of algorithm. For other cases where stitching is not that important, but there is a very high dimensional action space, for example, and it's very hard to use Q-learning style, we can use Monte Carlo tree search style method. So we have the flexibility to pick and choose based on what the domain requires.
Okay, I think I will have to pass the next question. Sorry, Jayabrata. In the interest of time, Arvind, I will ask you to continue resume.
Yeah. So far what I've described are results where we have done model-based RL on low-dimensional compact spaces. And by that I mean in the simulated robotics task that I showed you, you actually observe what is the joint location of the limbs and so on, and you use that to predict your actions. But in more real-world applications, we may not have access to these like low-dimensional representations. Like we don't have XYZ coordinates of every object in the scene and so on. We only have access to more realistic perception devices like cameras or touch sensors and so on. And typically the conventional wisdom is that model-based methods struggle when you go to high-dimensional spaces because you have to deal with modeling in this high-dimensional space. So how can we address that? So the extension to model that I want to present next is exactly doing this. Like how can we extend these offline model-based RL ideas to more high-dimensional spaces, particularly spaces involving vision. And this project was co-led by 2 students at Stanford, Rafael and advised by myself and Professor Chelsea Finn. So again, as I mentioned, to extend model-based methods to high-dimensional image spaces, we basically have 2 requirements in practice. The first is we need the ability to model high-dimensional objects like images. And we need an efficient way to optimize the policy after learning the model. So to address both of this, what we use are variational autoencoders. So again, I don't want to go into the details too much, but in very simple terms, what they do is essentially take a very high dimensional object, such as an image, and compress them into a very low dimensional representation through a bottleneck. And then we have a deconstruction phase where, again, this low dimensional representation is deconstructed to produce an image. And the goal is for these 2 images to be the same on a pixel difference level. And variational autoencoders are just an extension to these simple autoencoders by making the encoder and decoder probabilistic and also enforcing a variational prior on the bottleneck distribution. So in the case of using this for learning a dynamics model, what we can do is learn these latent state space models, where effectively we take a particular image, let's say this one, and then we compress it and get like a low dimensional state representation denoted by ST-1. Then ST-1 and the actual action AT-1 to predict a new latent state space ST and use this ST to deconstruct an image. And we want this deconstructed image to basically be the same as the image that should have actually been there at time t. So this gives us a loss function through which we can optimize both the encoder, decoder, as well as the transition dynamics model. And then we use the exact same approach that we used with the pessimistic MDP in model, where basically we learn ensembles of these models. So we are going to learn a fixed encoder and a fixed decoder, but we will have ensembles of models that capture the transitions in the latent state space. And we again use disagreement between these latent codes to form our estimate of whether a particular state is known versus unknown, and optimize the model the same way. And what is particularly neat about these latent state space models, such as like variational autoencoders, is that once we learn this model, which is primarily the composition of this encoder, transition model, and the decoder, for optimizing the policy, we actually don't need the decoder at all. We can just take a particular starting state, like sample anything from the data set, for example, and then all the future transitions, when we do rollouts in the model, can be only preserved completely in the latent state space, and we don't have to deconstruct the image at all. And as a result, we still preserve this property that you can do thousands of rollouts in parallel on a GPU and really optimize your policy very efficiently. So when we try this on a suite of tasks, now these are again similar simulated tasks of varying degrees of complexity. So we have a task where we need to do locomotion. Here, this is a simple whole arm manipulation task with opening the door. And we have a couple of dexterous manipulation tasks where you have to manipulate a few objects. All of these tasks are solved with image inputs now. So we are no longer getting the location of the object and the position of the hands or anything like that. We just observe this particular image, and on the basis of this image, we need to predict what the action is. And what we again find is that our algorithm, now denoted by LOMPO, significantly outperforms all of the other algorithms, including some of the algorithms that we tried, like CQL and so on. And in particular, because of using these latent state space models, our policy optimization can be super efficient. So we don't know how long we have to run some of these like Q-learning algorithms. It could be a day, it could be 2 days, it could be a week. Whereas in the case of LOMPO, we can optimize this very efficiently in a matter of like 2 to 3 hours. We also extended this and also tried to evaluate this on a real world setup. What we do here is take a data set from a different paper. So for this whole project, we never actually collected any data on the robot at all. The only time we even touched the robot is for the final evaluation. So we learned a policy, we simply rolled it out for evaluation statistics purposes, and we did not touch the robot any other time at all. So the dataset consists of 1,000 task agnostic exploration rollouts, and the success metric is based on a classifier. So we manually picked 200 images where the drawer is closed and 200 images where the drawer is open, and trained a classifier to detect whether the drawer was closed or not. And the task here is to use this particular data set to make the robot to close the drawer. And again, this is not a particularly hard task in the sense that there are like many ways in which we can script a policy to make a robot close the drawer. What is particularly exciting is that we have a very strong proof of concept now that we can take a data set from a completely different paper that you had no control over, like learn a policy from it, and it actually works pretty well. We get a success rate of about 76%, which is quite respectable. Whereas all the other algorithms that we compared with basically get 0% success rate. There is a little caveat with this result though, which is that all of the algorithms that we compared with, they are not offline RL algorithms per se. They are RL algorithms that have just been run with and considering that there is this distribution shift, which is like a huge problem in offline RL, it's not too surprising that these algorithms actually just don't learn at all. That said, there are very few other offline RL algorithms that are actually capable of running with image spaces as well. So at the time of publishing this paper, basically the only other alternative was CQL, but it was taking too long for us to run like real world experiments. So this was the only like reasonable algorithm that we could run, and we actually observed pretty strong success numbers with it. Yeah, so I can again maybe stop here and take 1 or 2 questions. I just have one more final part of the talk, which will probably take 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, Nishit has a question. How is the online fine-tuning done? Would the Learn Dynamics model help in it?
Yes, so I think maybe I will touch upon this a bit more later, but here there is actually no online fine tuning in this project at all. Like we just take the data set, the policy is turned completely offline, and then we just simply deploy it in the real world. The robot is not using any of these like real world trials to improve its performance. But there is a different aspect to this question, which is very, if we take this model that was learned for one task, let's say an agent to walk, can you use that same model to make it do other things? Because the physics is shared, maybe you could use it to make the agent hop or jump or something else. And I think that's a very interesting question. And that is a unique capability that model-based methods actually enable. And I will talk about that a bit more in the final part of my talk.
So in this data set, the actions are what? Positions?
Yes, so the actions here would be, it would be how to move your robot on. So it will be something like the velocity that you have to use or the torques that you have to apply to your robot to make it move.
Oh, it's a combination. Okay, it's a tuple of velocities, torques.
It's mostly, I would say it's mostly torques. That's the primary modality, but you can sort of repurpose it to do other action modalities as well. But the native form is torques.
And you mentioned velocities. So this velocity is being, I believe there is some low-level controller that is trying to track this velocity in the robot.
Actually, no. So what we just do is use a stream of images. So the latent code over here, the information from this image can propagate to the, in some sense, the state can encode where the robot was in the previous time step and where it is now. And as a result, like implicitly infer what the velocity is. We don't have to explicitly provide the velocity information.
Oh, so your command is torque, you're saying?
The command is torque, yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you just, okay. So then the torque is simply, is converted into currents. Currents are tracked in the motors. Okay. Yes. Or is it more like your end effector, the spaces?
Yeah, so actually that's what I meant. So I think the easy way to do it is by using the end effector, but we don't do it. We use the native action space, which is the actual torques.
Okay, okay. Oh,
I mean, in some sense, we made the problem more complicated for ourselves, but even then we are able to do it quite well.
And you don't have anything else, right? You don't have like impedance control or any of those things incorporated. Okay.
It's just a motor torques with PD control, basically.
Motor torques with the PD control. Okay.
Yes. So, I mean, you set the desired torque level, but you may not actually achieve it. So you use a PD control.
So the PD control will be on the position and velocity?
No, on the torques itself, right? Like, so you could say, yeah, I want my motor to give me a torque of like, or something like that, but the motor may not be able to actually produce it.
Okay, you mean the current control is PID control?
Yes. Yes.
Got it. Okay, any other questions? Looks like there are no other questions. Okay, you can continue, Arvind.
Yeah, so for the final part of my talk, I want to sort of highlight that the whole premise till now was that, hey, you're going to construct like some approximate MDP model, and there is going to be a reward function. Either you're just explicitly given this reward function, or you have reward labels in your data set using which you can basically learn a reward function. But where does this reward label or this reward function actually come from? So in some applications, there are actually objective reward functions that we can use. In things like games, like Go or Atari, you actually know whether you won or not. So there are like objective rewards. In recommendation systems, you can use click-through rates. In inventory control, you can look at what the actual purchase rates are and so on. So these are like objective reward metrics that you can use in some applications. So like this assumption of knowing the reward function is not a problem in some applications, but it actually is a problem in many other applications, particularly if you look at robotics or anything that involves like learning behaviors. Like, for example, if you want to do like character animation, if you do character animation and make like a character move in a way that a human would, how would you actually come up with a reward function such that if you were to optimize it, would generate motions that look human-like? that is actually extremely difficult. So for example, if we like think of a kid who wants to imitate some motions that they are observing on the TV, like maybe they have some intrinsic reward mechanisms in their head that they are using to drive this learning, but we don't have access to that. And if you want to teach your kid or anyone how to learn a bike or something like that, you don't tell them, hey, here is a reward function, go and optimize it. Like you use a completely different way of performing this, which is much more like driven by imitation learning rather than reward optimization. Although we could convert imitation learning to an implicit reward optimization, but the reward function is not explicitly handed down, it's sort of inferred from the demonstrations. So to sort of highlight this point, so you might think, okay, can't I just like engineer my way out of it? Can't I just script my way out of it? Like what if I hand design a reward function? So here is like a project that we did a while ago where we tried to learn, make a dexterous hand perform like various different tasks. So here is a hand specified reward function that we use, which basically said, no, the hammer has to hit the nail has to go in. Idiosyncratic grasping and like hitting strategies that don't really look human-like, and we don't really want these types of motions. And we actually tried like really hard to script a reward function that captures all the human intuitions, but it turns out to be like ridiculously hard. And as an anecdote, like if you put the nail with the board like a little farther ahead, where reaching it is not like super easy, the hand actually just picks up the hammer and throws it at the nail. So it comes up with all these like weird idiosyncratic strategies that do indeed optimize the reward function. So they are doing their job, but scripting the right reward function that delivers the behaviors that we want turns out to be extremely difficult. So we can address this by essentially conveying these human stylistic aspects through just demonstrations. So there are like many ways we can use to collect demonstrations, like kinesthetic teaching and so on. In this particular case, we used like a virtual reality based teleoperation setup where you can wear a glove, like what you see on the video over there, and then your movements in the hand are essentially like replicated in the virtual reality setup. So this is like a way for you to collect these teleoperated demonstrations and use them for imitation learning purposes. So if we like naively just take this human data, let's say, hey, human, give me 1 hour worth of teleoperation data, and then successful policies, they point out this issue of covariate shift, where you only have data sort of in the right regimes, and if you start making any error, you kind of compound on your own errors, and as a result, like drift too quickly from the demonstrations. So this idea of just taking human demonstrations, simply running supervised learning and doing nothing else, actually does not end up working well. What we had to do is essentially combine learning from experience and demonstration. So you use these demonstrations to help convey the stylistic aspects of what you want, but then you actually have to collect like more data, either through interactions or use some offline data set to enrich the state space that you can cover, and as a result, like learn some of these better policies. And we are actually successful in doing that. So here are some demos where we got the robot hand to pick up an object and take it to some location, pick up a hammer properly and hitting the nail, open doors, and so on. I don't want to get into the details of this particular project because I think that is somewhat more domain specific and robotics oriented, but I want to convey some of the more machine learning aspects of this. So one framework that is very popular for trying to do some of this imitation learning research is what's called like generative adversarial imitation learning. So this is essentially taking inspiration from GANs that have been very successful in generative modelings, putting them for the purposes of imitation learning. So what we have are essentially expert data sets or expert demonstrations, and we want to create essentially a policy such that if you were to roll out this particular policy in the environment, the observations that you see or the images that you see are more or less indistinguishable from those images that you got from the expert. So the way to do that is you would take your agent and perform interactions in the environment and generate trajectories. So these trajectories would be considered negative samples, and the trajectories that you get from the expert or this expert data bank would be considered positive samples, and you train a discriminator or a classifier to distinguish between your synthetically generated images or your generated images and the expert images. And you use this classification probability as a means of, as essentially the reward signal to learn the policy optimization. So ultimately, what would end up happening is if you are very successful, you would end up with a policy such that the trajectories that the policy would generate and the trajectories that the expert would generate are indistinguishable. And as a result, the classifier cannot say whether it is the expert or the agent generated data. And that is the sort of the optimal point to be in. But there are some critical flaws with this approach. If you look at this particular equation that describes what you would see is that for this generative adversarial imitation learning to work, you actually require on-policy samples. You cannot perform this very easily using off-policy reinforcement learning, because intuitively you have to essentially perform your rollouts to judge if those images are the same or different from what you see from the experts. So because it is on policy, it has two problems. Firstly, it becomes sample inefficient. And secondly, it is not easily compatible with off-policy or offline reinforcement learning. And our project over here is essentially to address this challenge by essentially extending an algorithm very similar to LOMPO, but to the case of imitation learning. It's again by the same set of authors. So in the first phase, what we end up doing is learning a latent state space model. So this is identical to what I described in the LOMPO paper. And you again construct a pessimistic version of this latent state space model. Then in the second phase, we essentially perform policy learning, where we again take the image. And what I'm describing in the slide is the interactive learning setup. So you actually get to interact with the environment to generate new real world samples on the fly. And you take this particular image that the agent collected, you encode it, and you go to this latent state space. And you use the same encoder to also encode the expert trajectory. And you perform this discriminator or the classifier training only in the latent state space. We don't actually need the image anymore. We perform this discriminative learning in the latent state space itself. And as a result, all the advantages that I described in the LOMPO carry over here. So you can just simply encode your image and then perform rollouts purely in the latent state space without any deconstruction. And you can judge whether this particular state is sort of from the agent generated distribution or from the expert distribution by simply querying the classifier in the latent state space itself. So the main difference here is that compared to the original Gale equation, we would still be using on-policy samples, but these on-policy samples are generated in your learned model, and they don't require any real-world queries. And as a result, you can freely do as many of these rollouts as you need. And since they are all happening in the latent state space, they are also computationally very efficient. So the only major change is that we are not now getting these samples from the true physics of the world. You will get it from some approximate physics that we actually have. But by the same argument that I used in LOMPO and in the model papers, this just incurs a small suboptimality gap, which is related to the modeling error. And it's not that much in practice as we will observe. So here are again 4 similar tasks where we want the agent to sort of locomote and perform a few manipulation tasks. And again, what we observe is that our algorithm, variational model-based adversarial imitation learning, shown in blue, actually outperforms many of the other baseline algorithms that we considered. Again, it's extremely stable because you are using on-policy samples in your synthetic model to perform this optimization. And as a result, the gradients are very stable and they almost have monotonic performance improvement. Whereas the other algorithms that are shown in red and green, they are using off-policy reinforcement learning algorithms with this Gale-like objective. And that introduces all sorts of non-stationarities because unlike in the regular reinforcement learning case, your reward function is no longer fixed or stationary. It is dependent on what data that you generate. So the data that you generate informs what the reward function is. And as a result, it introduces this non-stationarity, which can be particularly problematic for off-policy reinforcement learning methods. Whereas if you use, which you can, if you have a learned dynamics model, then you get very stable progress as shown in the blue over here. And finally, to close up, what this also enables is zero-shot imitation learning or offline imitation learning. And by that, what I mean is, suppose we performed a few imitation learning tasks that involve, let's say, this agent just learning to stand up on the ground and not move. So initially it will be dropped on the floor and it has to learn to stand in place. And you also perform like an imitation learning task where you make this agent run really fast. Suppose our goal is to now make the agent like walk slowly. In this particular case, the dynamics model that we will learn based on these two tasks captures a broad set of physics that allows you to learn this new policy or this new behavior without any additional real world interactions at all, purely by just using the learned dynamics model. And we also show this in this manipulation example where on the training tasks, you consider the manipulator rotating the valve in the clockwise and anti-clockwise, as well as a four-pronged valve in the anti-clockwise way. But the target task, which is completely new, is to rotate the prong in the clockwise way. And you just have to give the agent 2 demonstrations of this desired behavior, and it can completely learn this new behavior without any real-world interactions. So on this sort of transfer experiments, again, what we find is that our algorithm, VMail, performs like significantly better than all of the other algorithms that we compare with over here. And it actually approaches very close to an oracle performance, meaning if we were to learn like an imitation learning or a reinforcement learning agent on this desired target task from scratch and like allow it to learn till asymptotic performance, this is the score that we get. And what we observe is that just with 0-shot transfer, we are actually able to get scores that are somewhat comparable to this oracle. So with that, I just want to summarize all of the points that I made in this talk. So if we compare model-free offline learning with model-based offline learning, the point that I want to make is that model-based methods have a number of appealing properties. Firstly, if you think about offline policy evaluation, meaning I give you a data set and I want you to evaluate 10 or 20 different candidate policies that I'm interested in deploying, let's say for ads recommendation or something like that. If you want to do this with a model-free method, what you have to do is every time cycle through this new data set, use the Bellman residual error to learn what the Q function would be, and then report what the off-policy evaluation is. And in spite of doing all that, you really may not have much guarantees on sort of how accurate your learned Q function is. Whereas if you do it with the model-based method, you just, which is like a one-time cost. And then after that, anytime you want to evaluate a new policy, you can simply perform on-policy rollouts on this learned model and report like an accurate estimate of what the performance would be. And we also have this very nice theoretical guarantee with this pessimistic MDP that the value that I will report in the pessimistic MDP is always a lower bound of the true value. So in some sense, I can actually rely more on this off-policy evaluation estimate. Secondly, if you want to generalize to new tasks, this can be extremely hard with a model-free method, but it is very easy with a model-based method like I showed, because if the underlying dynamics or if there's physics that is shared across different tasks that we are interested in, then we can think about learning one shared dynamics model that will end up working for multiple different tasks because they all share the same underlying physics. And finally, if you want to do imitation learning, it is not at all clear how to use this with the model-free algorithm because the reward functions are not explicitly available. And you have to essentially infer the reward functions through like a Gale-like procedure, which introduces this distribution shift issue that you require on-policy rollouts to get accurate estimates, which can be very difficult with like model-free off-policy RL algorithms. Whereas if you use model-based algorithms, you can simply do on-policy rollouts in the learned model. And as a result, it's very good in the imitation learning setting. So again, some of the highlights are that these model-based algorithms are compute efficient. They have strong theoretical guarantees and also result in very good empirical performance. And the workflow with offline RL overall, and in particular with model-based methods, is very simple. We just perform self-supervised model learning and perform policy learning with like predominantly on-policy style learning methods. So it makes the workflow very simple and easy for practitioners to use on different applications. So with that, I'll stop, and if there are a couple of questions, I'm happy to take them too.
Okay, fantastic. Very nice talk, Arvind. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
I had one question in the variational methods for imitation learning. What was the dimension of the latent variable, and how do you choose it for the different?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think we typically just sort of relied on sort of intuitions that people have gained in the vision and the generative modeling community. So it's typically like 128 dimensional latent code, and it seems to be like quite sufficient. Like both, if you think about continuous spaces, or if you think about like discrete codes, like in the case of VQVAEs, you can model like 2 power 128 dimensional, 2 power 128 different latent codes with 128 discrete variables. So I think they tend to be like quite powerful in terms of modeling capabilities.
That is for images as inputs, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And the actions are always going to be low dimensional, so we don't have to worry about that.
Okay. Okay. Final question from my side. You showed that in the last slide, the model-based methods are clearly the winner for offline data, right?
I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I think my personal take is that they have a lot of appealing properties.
Okay, so you don't want to really go outright. Okay, that's good. Then what about online learning? Okay, what is your opinion on model-based methods for online learning?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on how much you care about sample efficiency. So if sample efficiency is sort of the main metric of interest, then I think model-based methods would still win out, because you tend to capture the structure and the physics of the world more with model-based methods, and you can synthetically generate more data, so it tends to be a bit more efficient. But if you don't care too much about sample efficiency and you really want to go after like that final bit of performance, so if 100% performance is worth so much more to you than 99% performance, then there is a case to be made that model-free methods are better, because in model-based methods you will incur a bias, and that bias may not be that bad for many applications, but you don't want any bias. You just want to go after and squeeze every final drop of performance, then maybe model-free methods might be better there.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so now I will go over the questions in the chat window one by one. The first one is by Pramod. How is the model able to achieve slower dynamics model? This is, I believe, the Walker slower dynamics.
Yes, so I think the sort of the interactions that we would have in the data set would cover all the span, right? Like, so you would have the agents like flopping around on the floor, attempting to do walks at different levels of speed. So it sort of would capture like a diverse thing. In fact, I don't have it on the slides, but you can make the walker actually walk or run backwards as well. Like even that is sort of supported by the models that we learn.
Okay, and this is achieved by simply changing the reward.
No, providing demonstrations of desired behaviors.
Oh, okay, okay. So again,
all this is in the imitation learning setup. So you use the model that you learned in the training phase, and then I provide a few demonstrations, and then you use this like Gale-like objective function to optimize the policy.
I see. Okay. Okay, next question. In all the data set used for training, there is reward stored for each actions. How to collect reward for some cases like driving on roads? Do we have to go for human coded reward function for something else or something else?
I think that's an excellent question, and that was sort of the basis for the final part of my talk, which is that in some applications the reward functions are sort of easy to code, or they are sort of objectively given, like things like click-through rates, or number of days to deliver a product in logistics and so on. So those are very objective, and we do have those proper rewards. But in sort of more behavior learning style methods, like driving cars or like making robots like open cabinets and so on, like we actually don't have objective reward functions over there. And typically in those settings, like imitation learning is perhaps a better framework than reinforcement learning. Although I think the offline learning pitch is common to both. We do want to rely on this like passive data sets to make progress on these questions, but we perhaps want to do more imitation learning rather than reward-driven policy learning.
Excellent. Okay, so the next question is from Anil. What would be the bottlenecks in using model-based offline RL for more complex behaviors, dynamic planning tasks, as examples?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think the major bottleneck that I would think is that the bias in the model might just be too much. I think our sort of results seem to suggest that this is sort of the traditional apprehension with model-based methods, but they are perhaps not really that true in practice is what we are observing. but there's still that general apprehension that maybe if I want to do like maybe kinodynamic tasks are perhaps not that hard, like sort of some of the results that we showed are in that flavor. But I think if you want to do other things like, I want to pour coffee where I have to like, pour liquids and things like that. Modeling fluid dynamics and things like that now become like much more complicated, especially if you want to model the like at the pixel level, how fluid flows and things like that. It can actually get like really complicated. So what situations do we have less model bias? What situations do we have more model bias? I think that's the open question. But I think this also ties in well with like the generative modeling community. So as we are making more progress with GANs and generative modelings and so on, I think it will also help the cause in model-based RL too.
Okay. All right. Any more questions? Audience, if you have questions, you can also raise your hand. Okay, looks like there are no more questions. So, okay, with that, okay, let's thank the speaker. So, Arvind, thanks a lot. It was an excellent talk. I learned a lot today, and I believe so was the audience. So, with that, I'd like to clap.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the attention. And thanks again for the organizers for inviting me. This was a great workshop. And again, so glad to see many friends and familiar faces in the audience.
Okay, yeah, hopefully next time we will be able to welcome you here and then give a talk here in person. All right. So with that, we'll end this morning session. We'll be meeting again later. I'm guessing it's at 4, right, Shalabh? I'm not really sure about the timings, but it's on the websites. So thank you all for attending today. See you soon. Thank you, Arvind.